Imagine living in a world where love was not simply felt but carefully performed. Welcome to Regency England, a time of elegance, strict rules, and silent glances that spoke louder than words. In the early 19th century, during the era shaped by figures like George IV, romance was not spontaneous. It was structured, monitored, and often controlled. Courtship was not just about two people. It was about families, fortune, and reputation. A gentleman in Regency England could not simply walk up to a lady, introduce himself, and begin a conversation, because such behavior would have been considered improper, even scandalous, and capable of damaging both his reputation and hers in a society that placed immense value on appearances, etiquette, and social order. So instead, every interaction between unmarried men and women had to be carefully managed through formal introductions, which acted as a kind of social permission slip, ensuring that both parties belonged to acceptable circles and that neither side risked embarrassment or suspicion, and these introductions were usually arranged by mutual acquaintances, family members, or respected figures within society who could vouch for the character and status of each individual, meaning that chance encounters rarely led to anything meaningful unless they were later formalized through proper channels, because without that validation, even the most innocent conversation could be interpreted as forward or inappropriate. And so from the very beginning, courtship was not driven by spontaneity or bold romantic gestures, but by a structured system that required patience, awareness, and strict adherence to unspoken rules that everyone understood yet rarely questioned. And this system was reinforced in the very places where social life unfolded, particularly at gatherings such as balls, dinners, assemblies, and promenades, which were not merely opportunities for entertainment, but carefully orchestrated environments where young men and women could meet under supervision, observe one another, and begin the delicate process of courtship, all while being watched by family members and the wider community. Because these events served as both social showcases and subtle marketplaces of marriage prospects, where a person's manners, appearance, and behavior were constantly evaluated, often more critically than they realized, and where a single misstep could linger in memory far longer than any success, shaping opinions and influencing future opportunities in ways that were difficult to undo. And so when a young lady entered such a setting, she did so with an acute awareness of how she was being perceived, knowing that her posture, her tone of voice, the way she greeted others, and even how she responded to conversation could all contribute to her reputation, which was considered one of her most valuable assets, something fragile yet essential, capable of determining not only her chances of marriage, but also her family's social standing. And because of this, she was expected to conduct herself with grace, modesty, and restraint at all times, avoiding anything that might appear overly bold, flirtatious, or improper, even if her intentions were innocent, while a gentleman, on the other hand, had his own set of expectations to uphold, as he was required to demonstrate politeness, respect, and a clear understanding of etiquette, ensuring that his behavior reflected well not only on himself, but also on those who introduced him, because his actions could just as easily affect the reputation of others within his social circle. And so the process of meeting someone new was never as simple as exchanging names, but rather a carefully choreographed interaction that began with a formal introduction, often delivered with precise wording and accompanied by a respectful bow or curtsy, signaling mutual acknowledgement and acceptance, after which conversation could begin, but even then it remained within certain boundaries, avoiding topics that were too personal, controversial, or emotionally charged, as the goal was not to reveal too much too quickly, but to establish a sense of refinement and compatibility over time, allowing impressions to develop gradually rather than through sudden declarations. And this slow, deliberate pace of interaction meant that courtship unfolded in stages, each one building upon the last, with initial meetings leading to further encounters at subsequent events, where familiarity could grow under the watchful eyes of others, and where repeated interactions signaled a level of interest that did not need to be openly stated, because in a society so attuned to nuance, even small details carried meaning, such as how often two people spoke, how long their conversations lasted, or whether they seemed at ease in each other's presence, all of which could be observed, interpreted, and quietly discussed by those around them, creating a kind of social narrative that existed alongside the courtship itself, influencing how it was perceived and whether it was encouraged or discouraged by family members, who played a significant role in guiding and sometimes controlling these relationships, as they were deeply invested in ensuring that any potential match aligned with their expectations regarding status, wealth, and respectability, and so a young lady rarely navigated this process alone, but rather with the support oversight of her family, who would often advise her on how to respond to certain individuals, which invitations to accept, and how to maintain the delicate balance between showing interest and preserving modesty, while also keeping a careful watch on the intentions and background of any gentleman who expressed attention, because trust was not given lightly, and any hint of impropriety could quickly lead to disapproval or intervention, and in this way, courtship became not just a personal experience but a collective one, shaped by the expectations and involvement of an entire social network, where individual desires were often secondary to broader considerations, and where every step forward required careful thought, patience, and adherence to a system that valued order over impulse, tradition over spontaneity, and reputation above all else, making the beginning of courtship less about immediate connection and more about navigating a complex web of social rules that dictated who could meet, how they could interact, and what those interactions ultimately meant within the context of Regency society. Privacy as it is understood today was almost entirely absent from the experience of courtship in Regency England, and for young women in particular. The idea of being alone with a man outside the bounds of marriage was not only discouraged, but actively prevented through a system of constant supervision that shaped nearly every social interaction they experienced, because society at the time placed extraordinary importance on a woman's virtue, viewing it as both a personal quality and a reflection of her family's honor, something that had to be protected at all costs, not only from genuine danger but from the mere appearance of impropriety, which could be just as damaging as any real transgression. And so from a very young age, girls were raised with the understanding that their behavior would be closely watched and judged, that their actions carried consequences beyond themselves, and that maintaining a flawless reputation required vigilance, restraint, and an almost constant awareness of how they might be perceived by others. And this awareness became even more intense once they entered the stage of life where courtship became possible, because at that point every glance, every word, and every interaction with the opposite sex could be interpreted as a signal, an invitation, or if handled poorly, a cause for concern. And to manage this delicate balance, the presence of a chaperone became an essential part of a young woman's daily life, not as a casual companion but as a necessary safeguard, someone who ensured that all interactions remained within the boundaries of propriety, and these chaperones were usually close relatives, such as mothers, aunts, or older married sisters, though sometimes trusted family friends could fulfill the role, and their responsibilities went far beyond simply accompanying the young woman from place to place, because they were expected to observe, to guide, and to intervene when necessary, maintaining an environment in which no situation could arise that might be considered compromising, and this meant that even the most seemingly harmless moments were carefully managed, so that a young woman could not receive a gentleman alone in her home, could not take a walk with him without supervision, and could not engage in prolonged private conversation without risking criticism, because the absence of a chaperone immediately raised questions, and questions could quickly turn into rumors, and rumors once spread were incredibly difficult to contain or correct, often taking on a life of their own as they passed from one person to another, growing more exaggerated with each retelling until they became accepted as truth regardless of their origin. And this fear of gossip was one of the most powerful forces shaping behavior during the Regency period, because reputation was not something that could be easily repaired once damaged, especially for women, whose social and marital prospects depended so heavily on the perception of their virtue and respectability, and so the constant presence of a chaperone was both a protection and a limitation, providing a sense of security while also restricting freedom in ways that modern audiences might find difficult to imagine, because it meant that genuine privacy was rare, that moments of personal connection had to unfold in public or semi-public settings, and that even when two people were developing feelings for one another, those feelings had to be expressed within a framework that allowed others to observe and, in many cases, to judge, and this created a unique dynamic in which communication became more subtle, more restrained, and often more meaningful precisely because it could not be overt, because a simple exchange of words carried weight when spoken under watchful eyes, and a brief moment of shared attention could hold significance when it was all that circumstances allowed. Yet at the same time, this environment required constant self-control, as individuals had to be careful not to reveal too much too quickly, not to act in ways that might be misinterpreted, and not to give others any reason to question their intentions or character. And this level of scrutiny extended beyond formal gatherings into everyday activities, such as visits, outings, and even casual encounters in public spaces, where the presence or absence of appropriate supervision could determine whether an interaction was considered acceptable or inappropriate. And for example, if a gentleman wished to visit a young lady at her home, he would do so during designated visiting hours, and even then, the meeting would typically take place in a common area, with other family members present or nearby, ensuring that the interaction remained visible and within acceptable bounds. And similarly, if the two encountered each other while out walking, they could not simply decide to stroll together unaccompanied, but would instead either limit their exchange to a polite greeting, or ensure that a chaperone was included, because anything else could be seen as a breach of etiquette. And this constant need for supervision also influenced the pace and nature of courtship, as it prevented the kind of spontaneous, deeply personal conversations that might otherwise accelerate emotional intimacy, forcing instead a gradual process in which trust and understanding developed over time through repeated interactions that were always, to some degree, observed. And while this might seem restrictive, it also meant that relationships were built on a foundation of patience and consistency, as individuals had to demonstrate their character not through grand declarations, but through steady, appropriate behavior that could withstand the scrutiny of both family and society. And in this way, the presence of a chaperone acted as both a gatekeeper and a witness, ensuring that any relationship that progressed did so with a level of transparency and social approval that aligned with the values of the time. Yet it also meant that personal desires were often subordinated to collective expectations, as individuals navigated not only their own feelings but the opinions and judgments of those around them, and this could create tension, particularly in cases where affection developed in ways that did not align perfectly with family expectations or social norms, because expressing such feelings openly was not always possible, and so they had to be managed carefully, often communicated indirectly or delayed until circumstances allowed for greater freedom. And this delicate balance between restraint and expression defined much of the courtship experience, shaping not only how relationships began but how they evolved, as every step forward required careful consideration of what was appropriate, what was permissible, and what might be said or implied by even the smallest action. And so the absence of privacy was not merely a limitation but a defining feature of Regency courtship, one that influenced behavior, communication, and emotional development in profound ways, creating a world in which love, if it emerged, did so within a framework of constant observation, where every interaction was part of a larger social narrative, and where maintaining one's reputation required an ongoing commitment to the rules and expectations that governed every aspect of public and private life. In a world where private conversations were rare and direct expressions of affection were constrained by strict social expectations, letters became one of the most important and delicate tools of courtship in Regency England, serving not only as a means of communication, but as a carefully controlled space where thoughts, emotions, and intentions could be expressed with a level of depth that everyday interactions rarely allowed. And yet even this seemingly personal form of connection was far from free or uninhibited, because letter writing itself was governed by its own set of unwritten rules, expectations, and risks, all of which required a writer to exercise great care in both what was said and how it was presented, as a single poorly chosen phrase could lead to misunderstanding, embarrassment, or even damage to one's reputation. And so from the very beginning, composing a letter was not a casual act, but a deliberate process, one that demanded attention to tone, structure, and propriety, ensuring that the message remained appropriate while still conveying meaning. And this balance between restraint and expression defined the art of correspondence during the period, shaping how relationships developed and how individuals revealed themselves to one another over time. Because unlike modern communication, where messages can be sent instantly and often without much thought, letters in Regency England required time, effort, and intention, from the careful selection of paper and ink to the physical act of writing, sealing, and delivering the message, all of which contributed to a sense of formality and significance that elevated even the simplest exchange into something more meaningful. And this sense of importance was further reinforced by the knowledge that letters were not always entirely private, as families often maintained a degree of oversight, particularly when it came to the correspondence of young, unmarried women, whose reputations needed to be protected from any hint of impropriety. And while not every letter was openly read by others, there was always an underlying awareness that it could be, or that its contents might become known through indirect means, and this awareness influenced the way people wrote, encouraging a style that was polite, measured, and often deliberately ambiguous, allowing the writer to communicate interest or affection without crossing the boundaries of acceptable behavior. And so rather than openly declaring love or desire, individuals relied on subtle cues, carefully chosen words, and nuanced phrasing to convey their feelings, creating a kind of coded language that could be understood by the recipient while remaining defensible if ever questioned by others. And this subtlety added a layer of complexity to correspondence, as both writer and reader had to interpret not only the literal meaning of the words, but also the intentions behind them, reading between the lines to uncover what was implied but not explicitly stated. And this process of interpretation became an essential part of courtship, as it allowed relationships to develop gradually, with each letter building upon the last, revealing a little more while still maintaining the appearance of propriety. And in this way, letters became a space where emotional intimacy could grow, even in the absence of physical privacy, providing a means for individuals to share their thoughts, reflect on their experiences, and respond to one another in ways that were not always possible in person. Yet this intimacy was always tempered by caution, as writers had to remain mindful of the potential consequences of their words, avoiding anything that might be considered too forward, too personal, or too revealing, especially in the early stages of a relationship, when impressions were still being formed and the boundaries of acceptable communication were more strictly enforced. And this meant that early letters often focused on general topics, such as recent events, mutual acquaintances, or observations about society, gradually incorporating more personal elements as familiarity and trust developed. And even then, expressions of affection were often indirect, conveyed through compliments, shared sentiments, or references to previous conversations, rather than explicit declarations. And this gradual progression allowed both parties to navigate the uncertainties of courtship with a degree of safety, ensuring that neither side risked overstepping the boundaries of propriety too quickly, while also creating a sense of anticipation and emotional investment that made each letter more significant, as it represented not only communication but a step forward in the relationship. And the act of receiving a letter itself carried its own emotional weight, as it signified that the writer had taken the time and effort to compose a message, to think carefully about what to say, and to initiate or continue a connection. And this could create a sense of excitement, curiosity, and even anxiety as the recipient opened the letter and began to read, searching for clues about the writer's intentions, feelings, and level of interest. And because letters were not instantaneous, there was often a delay between sending and receiving, which added another layer of tension and anticipation to the process, as individuals waited for a response, wondering how their words would be received, and what the reply might reveal. And this waiting period could be filled with reflection, speculation, and sometimes doubt, as the absence of immediate feedback left room for interpretation and uncertainty, making each exchange feel more significant and more emotionally charged. And yet, despite these challenges, letters provided a unique opportunity for self-expression, allowing individuals to present themselves in a way that was thoughtful, composed, and reflective, as they had the time to consider their words, to revise their thoughts, and to craft a message that aligned with both their feelings and the expectations of society. And this ability to shape one's communication in such a deliberate manner contributed to the development of relationships that were built not only on attraction but on shared ideas, mutual respect, and an understanding that unfolded over time. And in many ways, the constraints placed on correspondence enhanced its emotional depth, as the need for restraint encouraged creativity, subtlety, and a heightened awareness of language, turning even the simplest phrases into expressions of meaning that extended beyond their surface. And this is perhaps why letters from the Regency period continue to be admired and studied, as they offer a glimpse into a world where communication was both an art and a discipline, where every word mattered, and where the act of writing itself became a bridge between individuals navigating complexities of courtship within a society that demanded both discretion and decorum at every turn. Balls in Regency England were far more than simple evenings of music and entertainment, because within the structured world of courtship they functioned as carefully orchestrated social arenas where relationships could begin, develop, and be publicly observed, all under the watchful eyes of family members, acquaintances, and the wider community. And for many young men and women these gatherings represented one of the few acceptable spaces in which they could interact with a degree of freedom that was otherwise unavailable in everyday life. Yet even this freedom was limited and guided by a complex system of etiquette that governed everything from how one entered the room to how one asked for a dance. And so from the moment a guest arrived, every detail carried significance, as appearances, manners, and behavior were immediately noticed, and quietly evaluated, creating an atmosphere in which individuals were constantly aware that they were not only participating in an event, but also presenting themselves as potential partners within a social framework that placed great importance on reputation and first impressions, and this awareness influenced how people dressed, how they moved, and how they engaged with others, because a ball was not just an opportunity to enjoy music and conversation, but a stage upon which one's character, charm, and suitability could be displayed in subtle yet meaningful ways, and at the center of this experience was dancing itself, which served as one of the primary forms of interaction between men and women, offering a structured and socially acceptable way to spend time together, to communicate interest, and to observe one another in close proximity without violating the norms of propriety. And yet even this seemingly simple activity was governed by strict rules that dictated how it should be conducted, ensuring that it remained refined, controlled, and appropriate at all times. And so when a gentleman wished to dance with a lady, he could not simply approach her casually, but was expected to request the dance with politeness and respect, often after having been properly introduced. And if the lady accepted, the two would take their places within the set, joining other couples in a coordinated sequence of movements that required attention, grace, and cooperation. And these dances, which often included forms such as the country dance or the quadrille, were not designed for intimacy in the modern sense, but rather for elegance and coordination, involving patterns that brought partners together and apart in a rhythm that allowed for brief moments of interaction within a larger group setting. And it was within these moments that much of the communication of courtship took place, because while conversation during the dance might be limited, the way in which a person conducted themselves could convey a great deal, from their level of confidence and attentiveness to their respect for social conventions and their ability to engage with a partner in a manner that was both considerate and engaging. And this meant that a single dance could leave a lasting impression, shaping how each participant was perceived not only by their partner but by those observing from the sidelines, who often took note of who danced with whom, how often, and with what apparent level of enthusiasm. And this observation was not merely idle curiosity but an integral part of the social dynamics of the event, as patterns of interaction could suggest emerging attachments or preferences, which in turn could influence how others responded to those individuals in future encounters. And so while a single dance might be seen as a polite exchange, multiple dances between the same pair carried a different weight, signaling a level of interest that went beyond casual acquaintance, and this was understood by everyone present, creating a subtle but powerful form of communication that did not require words to be effective. And yet this visibility also meant that individuals had to be careful not to overstep, because dancing too frequently with the same person could attract attention and speculation, potentially leading to gossip if it was perceived as excessive or inappropriate. And this risk required a careful balance, as individuals sought to express interest without drawing unwanted scrutiny, navigating a fine line between attentiveness and restraint. And this balance was further complicated by the presence of family members, particularly chaperones, who often observed these interactions closely, ensuring that their daughters or relatives were not engaging in behavior that might compromise their reputation. And while they did not necessarily intervene in every instance, their presence served as a reminder that even in a setting designed for social interaction, boundaries remained firmly in place, shaping how individuals behaved and how relationships developed. And beyond the dance floor itself, balls also provided opportunities for conversation, though these two were influenced by the surrounding environment, as discussions typically took place in communal spaces where others were nearby, creating a setting in which privacy was limited and interactions were subject to observation. And this meant that even casual exchanges were conducted with a degree of formality, avoiding topics that might be considered too personal or controversial, while still allowing for the gradual development of familiarity and connection. And in this way, the ball functioned as a microcosm of Regency society, reflecting its values, its expectations, and its emphasis on decorum, while also providing a space in which individuals could explore the possibilities of courtship within those constraints. And for many, these events were among the most anticipated occasions of the social calendar, not only because they offered entertainment but because they represented moments of opportunity, where introductions could be made, impressions could be formed, and relationships could take shape in ways that might not be possible elsewhere. And yet despite the excitement and energy of the setting, there was always an underlying sense of control, as every aspect of the experience was shaped by the need to maintain propriety, to protect reputation, and to adhere to the expectations of a society that valued order and restraint above spontaneity. And this tension between freedom and limitation defined the experience of the ball, creating an environment in which individuals could express themselves, but only within carefully defined boundaries, and where even the most joyful moments of music and movement were infused with a deeper significance, as they formed part of a larger narrative of courtship, one in which every dance, every glance, and every interaction contributed to the unfolding story of how relationships began and evolved within the elegant, yet restrictive world of Regency England. When the time came for a gentleman to consider proposing marriage in Regency England, the decision was rarely driven by sudden emotion or impulsive desire, but rather by a careful and deliberate process shaped by social expectations, family interests, and long-standing traditions that defined marriage not simply as a union between two individuals, but as a significant alliance between families, fortunes, and social positions. And because of this, the path to a proposal was often preceded by a period of observation, interaction, and quiet evaluation, during which both parties, as well as their families, assessed the suitability of the match in terms that extended far beyond personal affection, taking into account factors such as wealth, lineage, reputation, and the potential benefits that the union might bring to both sides. And this broader perspective meant that even when genuine feelings existed, they were rarely the sole determining factor in whether a proposal would be made or accepted, as practical considerations carried immense weight in a society where financial stability and social standing were closely tied to marriage. And so before a gentleman could formally express his intentions to a lady, it was often expected, or at least strongly advised, that he first seek the approval or consent of her family, particularly her father or the male guardian responsible for her welfare, because this step demonstrated respect, seriousness, and an understanding of the social order, and it also provided the family with an opportunity to evaluate the gentleman's character, his financial situation, and his prospects, ensuring that he was capable of supporting a household and maintaining or improving the family's position within society. And this preliminary discussion could be formal or informal, depending on the circumstances, but it carried significant importance, as a lack of approval at this stage could effectively prevent the proposal from moving forward, regardless of the feelings between the couple. And this reality highlights the extent to which individual choice was intertwined with family authority, as young women, in particular, were often expected to consider their family's wishes and advice when responding to a proposal, balancing their own emotions with the expectations placed upon them. And while outright coercion was not always the norm, the influence of family opinion could be powerful, shaping decisions in subtle yet meaningful ways. And once the necessary permissions had been sought or at least informally secured, the gentleman would then proceed to make his proposal directly to the lady, typically in a private yet still appropriate setting, such as a drawing room, with the understanding that others were nearby, ensuring that the interaction remained within the bounds of propriety while allowing for a more personal exchange than was possible in larger social gatherings. And even in this moment, which might be imagined as deeply romantic, there remained an element of formality, as the gentleman was expected to express his intentions clearly and respectfully, often outlining not only his feelings but also his ability to provide, his respect for her family, and his desire to enter into a partnership that would be both emotionally and practically sound. And the lady, in turn, was expected to respond with equal care, considering not only her own sentiments but also the implications of her answer, as acceptance would set in motion a series of events leading to engagement and marriage, while refusal had to be delivered in a manner that preserved dignity and avoided unnecessary offense, particularly if the gentleman was well regarded within her social circle. And this exchange, though deeply personal, was still influenced by the broader context in which it took place, as both parties were aware that their decision would soon become known to others, shaping how they were perceived and how their future interactions would unfold. And in cases where the proposal was accepted, the engagement that followed was not merely a private agreement, but a public declaration, often shared with family and close acquaintances before gradually becoming known within the wider community. And this period of engagement served as a transitional phase, during which the couple could become more familiar with one another while still adhering to the expectations of propriety, as they were now recognized as being committed but not yet married, and this status allowed for slightly greater freedom in their interactions, though it did not eliminate the need for supervision or adherence to social norms. And during this time, practical matters were also addressed, including financial arrangements, settlements, and preparations for the wedding, all of which underscored the reality that marriage was as much an economic and social contract as it was an emotional union, and these arrangements could involve detailed negotiations between families, particularly in cases where significant wealth or property was involved, ensuring that both parties entered the marriage with a clear understanding of their rights, responsibilities, and expectations, and this emphasis on practicality did not necessarily diminish the presence of affection, but it did place it within a framework that prioritized stability and long-term security, reflecting the values of a society in which marriage played a central role in maintaining social structure and continuity. And yet, despite these constraints, there were moments within this process where genuine emotion could be expressed and experienced, particularly in the more personal exchanges between the couple, whether in conversation or correspondence, where they could begin to build a deeper understanding of one another beyond the formalities that had brought them together. And in this way, the proposal marked not only the culmination of the courtship process, but also the beginning of a new phase, one in which the relationship could develop further within the accepted boundaries of engagement, allowing for a gradual blending of personal connection and social expectation. And while modern perspectives might view the formality and structure of this process as restrictive, it also provided a sense of clarity and purpose, ensuring that both parties entered into marriage with a shared understanding of what it entailed, and that their union was supported, or at least acknowledged, by the families and communities that surrounded them. And so the act of proposing in Regency England was not a single, spontaneous gesture, but a carefully considered step within a larger system, one that balanced emotion with obligation, personal desire with social expectation, and individual choice with collective approval, ultimately reflecting the values and priorities of the time in which it took place. And yet, despite the weight of expectations, the ever-present scrutiny of society, and the rigid framework that defined how men and women were allowed to interact, love in Regency England was not extinguished by these limitations, but rather reshaped by them, taking on forms that were quieter, more restrained, and often more profound than the bold, uninhibited expressions that might be imagined in a less regulated world. Because when direct declarations were discouraged and private moments were rare, individuals learned to communicate in ways that were subtle, intentional, and deeply meaningful, finding significance in gestures that might otherwise seem small or insignificant. And it was within these moments that genuine connection could emerge, growing slowly but steadily beneath the surface of formal interactions, as two people came to understand one another, not through grand displays of passion, but through consistency, attentiveness, and the careful exchange of thoughts and feelings within the boundaries that society allowed. And this process, though constrained, often required a level of patience and emotional awareness that gave relationships a different kind of depth, as individuals had to listen more closely, observe more carefully, and interpret more thoughtfully, learning to recognize the meaning behind a glance, the tone of a voice, or the phrasing of a letter, because these were the tools through which affection was expressed. And in a world where so much was left unsaid, what was communicated carried a heightened importance, making each interaction feel deliberate and considered. And this deliberate nature of courtship meant that relationships were rarely rushed, but instead unfolded over time, allowing feelings to develop gradually as trust and familiarity grew. And while this could be frustrating for those who longed for more immediate expressions of emotion, it also created a foundation upon which deeper connections could be built, as individuals were given the opportunity to see one another in a variety of social contexts, to observe how they behaved with others, how they handled expectations, and how they navigated the complexities of their environment, all of which contributed to a more comprehensive understanding of character than might be achieved through private, isolated interactions alone. And in this way, the limitations imposed by society did not entirely prevent emotional intimacy, but rather redirected it into channels that emphasized subtlety, resilience, and mutual respect. And this is perhaps why the relationships that did flourish within this system often carried a sense of quiet strength, as they had been tested not by dramatic obstacles, but by the steady pressure of maintaining propriety while nurturing genuine feeling. And this balance between restraint and emotion is something that was later captured with remarkable insight by writers such as Jane Austen, whose works explored the nuances of courtship and the ways in which individuals navigated the tension between societal expectation and personal desire, illustrating how love could emerge not in spite of these constraints, but sometimes because of them, as the very act of adhering to social rules required individuals to develop qualities such as patience, humility, and attentiveness, which in turn contributed to the formation of more thoughtful and enduring relationships, and within this context, even the smallest moments could take on great significance. A brief meeting across a crowded room, where eyes met and quickly turned away, could linger in memory far longer than an extended conversation might in a more permissive environment, because it represented a connection that had to be acknowledged without being openly pursued, and a carefully written letter, composed with precision and restraint, could convey layers of meaning that went far beyond its surface, offering insight into the writer's thoughts and emotions while still maintaining the appearance of propriety. And a shared dance, conducted within the structured patterns of the ballroom, could provide a rare opportunity for closeness, for the exchange of a few words, or even for a silent understanding that passed between partners as they moved together in harmony. And these moments, though fleeting, formed the building blocks of relationships, creating a tapestry of experiences that gradually brought individuals closer together, even as they remained outwardly bound by the expectations of their society. And this duality, of feeling deeply while expressing cautiously, defined much of the emotional landscape of Regency courtship, shaping not only how relationships began, but how they were sustained, as individuals learned to navigate the space between what they felt and what they could openly show, finding ways to honor both their emotions and their obligations. And while this might seem restrictive from a modern perspective, it also highlights a different way of understanding love, one that is not solely dependent on overt expression, but that can exist and even thrive within limits, drawing strength from the very challenges it faces. And this is perhaps one of the most enduring aspects of the period, the idea that love, when placed within boundaries, does not necessarily diminish, but can instead become more focused, more intentional, and in some ways more meaningful, as it requires effort, discipline, and a willingness to endure uncertainty. And this endurance, this quiet persistence of feeling in the face of constraint, is what gives the romances of the Regency era their distinctive character, setting them apart from other forms of love that may be more immediate but less tempered by reflection and restraint. And so while the world of Regency England may have been defined by rules, expectations, and constant observation, it was also a world in which individuals found ways to connect, to understand one another, and to build relationships that, though shaped by their circumstances, were no less real or significant, and in some cases perhaps even more so, because they had been formed not in the absence of limitation but within it, proving that even in the most structured and controlled environments, the human capacity for love remains resilient, adaptable, and ultimately enduring. Even after a courtship had successfully navigated the rigid expectations of society and a proposal had been accepted, the story of romance in Regency England did not simply end with a declaration of love, because what followed was just as structured, just as carefully observed, and in many ways even more revealing of how relationships were shaped by the world around them, as the period of engagement introduced a new phase in which affection, duty, anticipation, and social responsibility became deeply intertwined, creating a space where two individuals, now publicly committed, began the transition from formal courtship to the reality of married life. And this transition was far from a private journey, as engagements were rarely kept secret for long, instead becoming known first within the family, and then gradually spreading through social circles, where they would be discussed, evaluated, and sometimes even celebrated, depending on how well the match aligned with expectations of status, wealth, and compatibility. And this public awareness added a new layer of pressure to the relationship, as the couple was no longer simply navigating their own feelings under quiet observation, but now existed as a recognized pair whose future together was anticipated by others, and whose behavior during this period could either reinforce or undermine the approval they had received. And so even as they gained a slightly greater degree of freedom to interact, they remained bound by the same principles of propriety that had governed their courtship, ensuring that their conduct reflected not only their personal commitment, but also their respect for the social order that had brought them together. And during this time, practical considerations came sharply into focus, because marriage in Regency England was as much an economic and social arrangement as it was an emotional union, and this meant that discussions of finances, property, and long-term security became essential, often involving not only the couple but their families, who played a significant role in negotiating the terms of the marriage, particularly in cases where wealth or inheritance was involved. And these negotiations could be detailed and complex, addressing issues such as dowries, settlements, and the management of assets, all of which were designed to ensure stability and protect the interests of both parties. and while such matters might seem distant from the idea of romance, they were considered necessary foundations for a successful marriage, reflecting a belief that love alone was not sufficient to sustain a household, and that careful planning and mutual understanding were equally important. And at the same time, the engagement period also provided an opportunity for the couple to become more familiar with one another in ways that had not been possible during earlier stages of courtship, as they were now allowed to spend more time together, to converse more openly, and to begin forming a partnership that extended beyond the formalities of social interaction. Yet even this increased closeness was tempered by the expectations of decorum, as they were still rarely left entirely alone, and their interactions continued to be shaped by the presence of others and the awareness that they were being observed, and this created a dynamic in which intimacy developed gradually through shared experiences, conversations, and moments of understanding that unfolded within a structured environment. And for some couples, this period strengthened their connection, allowing them to build a sense of trust and compatibility that would support them in married life, while for others, it could reveal differences or challenges that had not been apparent before, highlighting the reality that courtship, with all its constraints and formalities, did not always provide a complete picture of what a lifelong partnership would entail. And yet, despite these uncertainties, the progression toward marriage was generally expected to continue, as engagements were not entered into lightly and breaking one could carry social consequences, particularly for the woman, whose reputation might be affected by such a development, and so there was often a sense of inevitability once an engagement had been announced, a forward movement toward the wedding that was both anticipated and carefully prepared for. And the preparations themselves became a significant part of this period, involving decisions about the ceremony, the gathering of family and friends, and the establishment of a new household, all of which required coordination, resources, and attention to detail, reflecting the importance of marriage as a social event as well as a personal milestone. And the wedding, when it arrived, was typically a formal and meaningful occasion, though not always as elaborate as modern ceremonies, serving as the official beginning of married life and the point at which the couple's relationship transitioned from a socially regulated courtship to a recognized and sanctioned union. And yet even this transition did not entirely remove the influence of societal expectations, as married life itself came with its own roles, responsibilities, and norms, particularly for women, who were expected to manage the household, support their husbands, and uphold the family's social standing, while men were expected to provide financially and maintain their position within society. And these roles, though often accepted as part of the natural order, could shape the dynamics of the relationship in ways that reflected the broader values of the time, emphasizing duty, stability, and mutual responsibility alongside whatever affection had brought the couple together. And in this way, the journey from courtship to marriage in Regency England can be seen not as a simple progression from romance to fulfillment, but as a complex process in which personal feelings, social expectations, and practical considerations were continuously intertwined, shaping each stage of the relationship and influencing how it developed over time. And yet within this structured and often demanding system, there remained space for genuine connection, for shared experiences, and for the growth of a partnership that, while defined by its context, was also shaped by the individuals within it, their choices, their understanding, and their ability to navigate the balance between what was expected of them and what they felt for one another. And it is this balance that gives the story of Regency romance its enduring fascination, as it reveals not only the constraints of the past, but also the ways in which people found meaning, connection, and even happiness within those constraints, creating relationships that were as much about adaptation and resilience as they were about affection, and demonstrating that even in a world governed by rules and tradition, the human desire for companionship and understanding could find its own path, evolving from the first cautious introduction to the shared reality of married life, and continuing beyond that into the everyday experiences that ultimately defined what it meant to love and to live together in Regency England. Yet even beyond the engagement, the ceremony, and the formal beginning of married life, the reality of relationships in Regency England continued to unfold in ways that revealed how deeply the values of that society shaped not only how love began, but how it endured, adapted, and sometimes struggled within the expectations placed upon it, because marriage was not seen as the conclusion of a romantic journey, but rather as the foundation upon which an entire shared life would be built. And this life was governed by roles, responsibilities, and social norms that both defined and limited the ways in which husbands and wives could express themselves and relate to one another. And for many couples, The transition from courtship to marriage brought with it a shift in focus, from the careful navigation of introductions and interactions to the practical realities of managing a household, maintaining social connections, and fulfilling the duties expected of their respective positions. And these duties were not insignificant, as they were tied to the broader structure of society, influencing how families functioned, how wealth and property were maintained, and how social standing was preserved across generations. And so within this context, love, if it existed, had to find its place alongside obligation, often expressed not through dramatic gestures, but through everyday actions, through consistency, cooperation, and a shared commitment to the life they had entered into together, and for women in particular. The expectations of married life were both defining and restrictive, as they were typically responsible for overseeing the domestic sphere, managing servants if the household was wealthy enough to employ them, organizing social engagements, and ensuring that the home reflected the family's status and values, all while embodying the virtues of modesty, grace, and propriety that had been emphasized throughout their upbringing. And these responsibilities required skill, patience, and adaptability, as the smooth running of a household was seen as a reflection of a woman's competence and character. And yet, despite the demands placed upon them, women often found ways to assert a degree of influence within their roles, shaping the environment of the home, guiding the upbringing of children, and participating in the social networks that connected families and communities. And in this way, their contributions, though sometimes overlooked in formal narratives, were essential to the stability and continuity of society, while men, on the other hand, were expected to engage with the public sphere, managing financial affairs, pursuing careers or maintaining estates, and representing the family within the broader social and economic landscape. And their success in these areas was closely tied to the family's overall well-being, creating a dynamic in which both partners had distinct but interconnected roles, each contributing to the functioning of the household in different ways. And within this structure, the nature of the relationship between husband and wife could vary widely, depending on personality, circumstance, and the degree of compatibility that had been established during courtship and engagement, as some couples developed strong partnerships based on mutual respect, understanding, and shared values, finding ways to support one another within the framework of their roles, while others experienced tension or distance, particularly if the match had been driven more by practical considerations than by genuine affection. And this variability highlights the complexity of marriage in Regency England, as it was not a uniform experience but one shaped by a combination of societal expectations and individual dynamics. And yet, regardless of the nature of the relationship, there remained a strong emphasis on maintaining appearances, as the perception of a stable and respectable marriage was important not only for the couple themselves, but for their families and social standing. And this emphasis could sometimes lead individuals to prioritize outward harmony over private satisfaction, navigating challenges in ways that preserved the image of unity even if the underlying reality was more complicated. And at the same time, the social world in which these couples lived continued to play a significant role in their lives, as visits, dinners, balls, and other gatherings remained important opportunities for interaction, connection, and the reinforcement of social ties. And within these settings, married couples often participated together, presenting themselves as a unit while also engaging with the broader community. And these interactions could provide moments of enjoyment, companionship, and even renewed connection, as shared experiences within a social context allowed couples to maintain a sense of engagement with one another and with the world around them. And over time, the relationship between husband and wife could evolve, shaped by shared experiences, challenges, and the passage of years, as they navigated the responsibilities of family life, the upbringing of children, and the changes that came with age and circumstance. And in some cases, the familiarity and partnership that developed through these shared experiences could deepen into a form of love that was less about initial attraction and more about enduring connection, built on trust, respect, and a shared history. While in other cases, the limitations and expectations of the system could create distance, particularly if individuals felt constrained by roles that did not fully align with their desires or personalities. And yet, even within these constraints, there were moments of individuality, of personal expression, and of genuine emotion that shaped the lived experience of marriage, as people found ways, both small and significant, to connect with one another, to express care, and to build a life that reflected not only the expectations of their society, but also their own values and experiences. And this interplay between structure and individuality is what makes the study of Regency relationships so compelling, as it reveals not only the rules and norms that defined the period, but also the ways in which people navigated, adapted to, and sometimes quietly reshaped those norms in their daily lives, creating a rich and nuanced picture of love, partnership, and society that goes beyond simple narratives of restriction or romance, and instead highlights the complexity of human relationships within a specific historical context, showing how even within a system that emphasized order, hierarchy, and tradition, there remained space for connection, growth, and the enduring human desire for companionship, which in the end was not confined by the rules of the time, but expressed itself through them, adapting to their shape while still retaining its essential character, and in doing so, leaving behind a legacy of stories, experiences, and insights that continue to resonate, offering a window into a world that, while distant in time, reflects many of the same questions and emotions that define relationships in any era, reminding us that while the forms of courtship and marriage may change, the underlying search for understanding, connection, and shared life remains a constant thread that links the past to the present. Even after marriage had formally united two individuals in Regency England, the reality of married life continued to be shaped by a complex interplay of social expectation, personal responsibility, and emotional negotiation, because marriage was not a static state but a dynamic process in which love, duty, and societal norms constantly interacted, and the experiences of husbands and wives were profoundly influenced by the cultural, economic, and familial frameworks within which they lived, and for many couples, the early years of marriage were filled with adjustments as both partners navigated their respective roles, expectations, and aspirations, learning to reconcile personal desires with the responsibilities imposed upon them, and these adjustments were made against a backdrop of a society that emphasized public appearance, propriety, and the demonstration of moral virtue, which meant that even within the domestic sphere, actions and behaviors were observed, evaluated, and in some cases, subtly critiqued by neighbors, relatives, and acquaintances, and because of this, couples developed strategies for maintaining harmony and presenting a united front, ensuring that their private dynamics aligned with the image of stability and respectability expected of them. And these strategies could include a range of practices, from the careful management of household routines to the cultivation of social connections that reinforce their standing within the community, and in many cases, the cultivation of mutual respect and understanding became essential, as the reality of daily life required cooperation, compromise, and the ability to navigate challenges together, and these challenges could range from practical concerns, such as the management of servants, finances, and property, to more personal matters, including the upbringing of children, the negotiation of emotional needs, and the balance of individual aspirations with shared responsibilities, and for women in particular. The domestic sphere offered both a realm of influence and a source of constraint, as they were tasked with organizing and maintaining the household, overseeing servants, managing schedules, and ensuring that social obligations were met, all while upholding the ideals of grace, modesty, and virtue that had been instilled throughout their upbringing, and these responsibilities demanded skill, patience, and strategic thinking, as the smooth running of the household was both a practical necessity and a reflection of the woman's character and competence. And yet, within this structure, there existed opportunities for agency, influence, and personal expression, as women could shape the environment of the home, guide the education and values of their children, and cultivate social networks that extended their family's reach and influence. And through these acts, they contributed significantly to the functioning of their households, the well-being of their families, and the stability of the broader social fabric, while for men, the public sphere required engagement with economic, social, and political responsibilities, as they were expected to provide for the household, manage estates or businesses, maintain relationships with influential peers, and uphold the family's reputation. And success in these areas was closely tied to both the security of the marriage and the perception of the couple within society, and the interdependence of these roles created a dynamic in which both partners had distinct but complementary functions, each contributing to the household in ways that reflected the values, expectations, and norms of their culture, and over time, the relationship between husband and wife could deepen as they learned to navigate these shared responsibilities, discovering compatibility, mutual support, and the potential for affection that was cultivated not only through personal inclination, but also through the disciplined practice of partnership. And this cultivation of connection often required ongoing attention, empathy, and negotiation, as the pressures of social expectation, domestic management, and familial obligations could strain even the most harmonious relationships, and within this context, communication became a critical tool, allowing couples to express needs, share concerns, and coordinate responsibilities in a manner that maintained both efficiency and harmony. And while such communication might appear mundane by modern standards, it played a central role in the ongoing development of the marriage, reinforcing trust, understanding, and a sense of shared purpose. And alongside these practical and communicative aspects, emotional life continued to unfold in ways that were shaped by both individual temperament and the structural limitations of society, as expressions of affection, intimacy, and care were often mediated by the expectations of propriety and the need to maintain decorum, requiring individuals to find subtle and creative ways to convey their feelings through gestures, shared routines, attention to detail, and moments of quiet companionship. And these forms of expression, though less overt than modern displays of emotion, could nonetheless be deeply meaningful, fostering a sense of connection and intimacy that grew over time, strengthened by the shared experiences, challenges, and successes that marked the couple's life together. And as children entered the household, the dynamic of the marriage further evolved, introducing new responsibilities, joys, and complexities, as parents negotiated the demands of child-rearing alongside the maintenance of their household, the pursuit of social obligations, and the nurturing of their own relationship. And this period often highlighted the necessity of partnership, as effective management of both domestic and social responsibilities required coordination, mutual support, and a shared vision for the family. And the presence of children also provided opportunities for affection, collaboration, and the cultivation of shared values, reinforcing bonds between husband and wife, even as it introduced new challenges and demands. And beyond the immediate household, the broader social environment continued to shape the couple's experience, as participation in community life, engagement with neighbors, involvement in charitable activities, and adherence to social rituals reinforced both their standing and their sense of collective identity. And these interactions could provide opportunities for enjoyment, mutual reinforcement of values, and the demonstration of competence and virtue, contributing to the overall stability and satisfaction of the marriage. And yet, even with these structures in place, the emotional quality of the relationship remained contingent upon the individuals themselves, their ability to communicate, empathize, and negotiate, as well as their capacity to cultivate affection, trust, and understanding amidst the constraints imposed by their culture. And this interplay between personal agency and societal expectation defined much of the lived experience of marriage in Regency England, highlighting the ways in which love, duty, and social context were inseparably intertwined. And it is this intricate dance between structure and emotion, obligation and desire, public perception and private feeling, that gives Regency marriages their distinctive character, revealing a world in which relationships were at once constrained by norms and enriched by the careful cultivation of connection, demonstrating that even within rigid frameworks, human beings sought understanding, intimacy, and shared life, navigating challenges with patience, strategy, and resilience. And in doing so, they created bonds that, while shaped by the circumstances of their time, reflect the enduring human capacity for partnership, empathy, and the pursuit of a meaningful, connected existence. And these marriages, with all their complexity, negotiation, and subtlety, leave behind a legacy of insight into the ways in which love and duty can coexist, offering a lens through which we can understand not only the past, but the universal dynamics that continue to shape human relationships across time, showing that while the forms and rules may differ, the effort, intention, and commitment required to sustain meaningful partnerships remain a timeless aspect of the human experience. And in this sense, the story of Regency marriages provides both historical understanding and enduring lessons about the interplay of emotion, responsibility, and society in the cultivation of a life shared between two people. And that brings us to the end of our journey through the fascinating world of Regency England, where courtship, love, and marriage were governed by rules, expectations, and the careful navigation of society's watchful eyes. From the first formal introduction to the subtle language of letters, the elegance of balls, the carefully considered proposal, and the intricate dynamics of married life, we have explored how people expressed affection, built relationships, and found connection in a world that demanded patience, restraint, and awareness at every step. Regency courtship may seem distant from our modern lives, yet it reveals something timeless about human nature, the desire for understanding, companionship, and meaningful connection, even in the face of limitations. It shows us how love can adapt to circumstances, thrive within boundaries, and grow stronger when nurtured with care, attentiveness, and respect. Every glance, every word, every dance, and every letter held significance, teaching us that even small gestures, when performed thoughtfully, can carry profound meaning. The story of courtship in Regency England is more than just a historical curiosity. It is a reflection of the universal human experience of learning to communicate, to understand, and to care for another person within the frameworks of the world we inhabit. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the etiquette, emotion, and elegance of Regency courtship, don't forget to support our channel by giving this video a like. Your likes help us know that you value the time and effort we put into bringing history to life in a way that is both informative and engaging. If you want to continue exploring history, uncover fascinating details about past societies, and learn about the ways people lived, loved, and connected in times gone by, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Subscribing ensures that you never miss a video, and it allows us to continue creating high-quality content that brings the past to your screen in a lively and engaging way. We also encourage you to share this video with friends, family, or anyone who loves history, romance, or social culture. Sharing is a wonderful way to keep the conversation going, as each viewer brings their own perspective, questions, and insights, enriching our collective understanding of the fascinating world of Regency England. When you share, you help connect history enthusiasts from all over, sparking discussions about how societies functioned, how love and relationships evolved, and how the values of the past continue to influence the present. Finally, we would love to hear from you in the comments section below. Let us know what part of Regency courtship fascinated you the most, whether it was the delicate art of letter writing, the elegance of the ballroom, or the carefully structured process of proposals and marriage. Your engagement is what helps our community grow, allowing us to create videos that cater to your curiosity and passion for history. So, if you enjoyed this journey through the subtlety, elegance, and emotion of Regency England, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Every click, every comment, and every share helps us bring more captivating stories from history directly to you. Stay connected, stay curious, and join us for the next chapter in exploring the lives, loves, and legacies of the past. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.